When you learn the lowercase letters in calligraphy, first you have to learn the basic strokes so that you understand how to make the shapes that form all of the letters. Now for capital letters, there isn't really a strict set of fundamental strokes, but the concepts are still the same, and you'll see some of the same shapes in the capital letters. So instead of breaking it down stroke by stroke, we're just going to show you 3 styles of each capital letter. And the first 2 styles are going to be a little bit more basic, and then the third one will be a little bit fancier. So we'll have the same baseline and header line, so this is where one lowercase letter would fit, like the letter A, also known as the X height. And for your capital letters, you want to make them at least twice as tall as your lowercase letters. You can make them taller, but I'm just going to show you within 2 spaces. So for the letter A, we're actually just going to make basically the same as our lowercase a, just at a larger scale. So we're just making it twice as tall, so this oval is twice as tall, and then we're going to make an underturn. So there's a couple differences between this and the lowercase a. First is that it doesn't have an entrance stroke, so we're not going to see the same type of entrance stroke on our capital letters. And then also this underturn is not going up to the same height as where it started like we normally would make for an underturn. Instead, it's ending at the header line. So that's the first style. It's pretty basic. The second style, we're going to start with our main stem of our capital letter, and we're going to see this in a lot of them. So basically, for the main stem, it's just going to end up being like a long rectangular shape. So if this is our main line, I'll add a parallel line by coming out and making this basically like a long rectangle. The next shape is basically like a compound curve shape where we are going to come up and then down and then back up. So we're starting at the header line instead of the baseline, and we're just going to come up and make the first part, which is like an overturn, and then you can think of the last part as an underturn. So altogether, this is kind of like a compound curve, or you can think of it as an overturn with an underturn right under it. And similar to how we shade the compound curve, we're going to add our thickness on this part of the line. And then lastly, you can cross the A however you want. Again, if you're planning on leaving these gaps open, you would want to lift your pen as you're crossing through. I usually like to make it kind of wavy. The third style for each letter that we're going to go over is loosely based on the copperplate style, which is traditionally done with pointed pen and is usually a little fancier. And this A starts with an upstroke that is basically like an elongated S curve. So it starts at the baseline, curves a little bit, and then becomes straight. And now I'm following the slant line, and then I'm going to curve at the top. So if you have trouble making this shape going upward, you can always start at the top and come downward. But just think of it as being an upstroke because we're not going to add any shade to it. So start at the base, curve. This is basically like your entrance stroke shape for your lowercase letters. And then this is kind of like the first half of an overturn. The next stroke is just a downstroke, and I'm going to follow the slant line. When I made this, I ended up ending right on a slant line, so I just traced over that. And that's our main stem, so I'm going to add some shading to that, except instead of making it rectangular like this, I want to make it more of a triangle shape. So I'm going to start at a point at the top, and then gradually make it wider as I get towards the bottom, and then close it off at the bottom. The crossbar is actually going to be a loop, and I'm going to start at this point, which is halfway between the baseline and the header line, and I'm going to come up and make this teardrop looking shape, and then finish it with this shape. So I left this gap here because I'm leaving my gaps open, but you could make this all in one motion. So we came up and around here, and this was a downstroke. I'm going to add a little bit of shading right here. So we're going to see on these capital letters that there are going to be primary shades on the main parts, and then some of them will have these secondary shades, which are just a little bit thinner on some of these smaller pieces. And then also for this letter, I'm going to add a little circle or teardrop shape at the bottom. So we have, again, our baseline, our header line, and our ascender. I'm going to make the B's 2 spaces tall as well. The first one is going to start the same way that this A did, with just a main stem that is basically like a rectangle shape that follows the slant line. And for these thicknesses, you want to try to make them about the same as the lowercase letters that you're writing next to. Okay, now we're going to make the first loop on top, and I like to start it about halfway between the header line and the ascender. And we're going to think about making an overturn that loops back in at this point, and then make a little loop that's horizontal. And this loop will end up being about halfway between the top and the bottom. And then we're going to end with another loop that's kind of like this shape at the bottom, but we're actually going to cross this through the stem. So I'm going to come down a little below the baseline, a little left of the stem, and then cross through. Like that. And then just to add some balance, we're going to add what's called an entry element over here. So it's not the same as an entrance stroke. And you can make this line as curved or fancy as you want it to be. I'm just going to do a basic little wave shape right there. And then for our shading for this part, so we came up and then down right here, so I'm going to add my secondary shade right here and right here. Second one is going to start pretty much the same, except for this one I'm not going to go all the way up to the ascender. I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap. And that's because I'm going to make the top loop, I'm actually going to start it over here and come up and around, and then over and connect it back here. Okay, so if I was to continue connecting this, this would end up being kind of like an oval shape, but I'm starting to the left of the stem, going up and around, leaving a little gap here, and then ending it right here. And then I'm going to finish with my bottom loop, go a little below the baseline again, and then come up back through. Now we were coming down for both of these curves, so again I'll add my shading on the inside of these curves. Our last B is going to start with the same shape that was in this A, except it's going to be a downstroke, so we're going to end up adding thickness to it. So I'm going to start at the top and make the same shape. And I'm going to kind of trace it along this guideline so you can see what the slant should look like. So I'm actually going to start a little bit to the right of this guideline at the very top, and then curve towards it, and then follow the slant line, and then curve away from it. So it's kind of like an elongated S, but this part stays along the slant line, and you don't actually make it an S shape like this. It never like crosses back over itself. The next shape has the same idea as this shape, except we're going to start this even further in, and then curve around and then make this shape. So I'm going to start here and curve around, and at this point it's kind of like an oval, and then I'm just going to keep going and curving around the outside. So again, this ends up being almost like an oval shape, and then this is the first loop of the B. Now right here you can make a little loop like we did right here, or you can just come together at this point. I'm going to make it a really little loop, so actually it ended up almost closing it off and then finishing with my bottom loop. Now for the stem, I should have added the shade before I did the rest of it, but that's okay. I'm going to basically follow the same shape that I made, and it'll end up looking kind of like a swell, like there will be more thickness in the middle than there will be at the ends. And then again, I'm going to add this teardrop shape, and then shading on these curves like we did here and here. Now, as I'm looking at this, normally I would add my curve on the inside of the shade, or of the shape. But here, this one looks a little bit too narrow, so I'm actually going to add my curve on the outside. That's one of the good things about faux calligraphy, is that you can kind of adjust as you go. Now for this part, we actually did make this a downstroke too. Remember, we came down and around, so I'm going to add a little bit of shading right here too. And this is, again, like I was saying up here for the A, our primary shade and secondary shade. In this B, this would be the primary shade, and then the rest would be the secondary. Our C's are going to be pretty simple. The first one is basically just going to be a large version of the C. So just twice as tall as you would make your lowercase letters, and that's all there is to that one. This one is going to end up being pretty much the same, except we're going to start with a little downstroke right here, and then make that C shape. So that just adds a little bit of interest to the top of it. Adding our curve right here, so I'm following the curvature. And then this was a little downstroke. You can add a little bit of a shading to that. And this one I'm going to start pretty much the same, except instead of starting like at this point, I'm just going to start at the top of the ascender and make my C shape. And then I'm going to go back in and add my shade before I finish the next part. Okay, for the rest of it, we're going to end up making a loop that actually starts over here and then comes around and connects up here. So we're going to want to pick up our pen right here. That's why I stopped to draw that shade first and make this loop. And this will end up being like a horizontal oval. And you can either start it here and come around and then connect it here, or it's kind of hard to make that connection perfect, so you could also start here and come around and then finish it off. So I'm going to start about at this point and start making my loop and then come up and connect it at the top. You want to make sure that if you do this type of C, that you bring this part and curve it around enough so it doesn't end up looking like an E, like a lowercase e, because if you didn't have that part, that's what it would look like. Alright, the last letter in this video is going to be the letter D. These two versions will be very similar to the two B's that we drew. So both of them are going to start with that main stem. And then the first D is going to be pretty similar to this one, except without this loop in the middle. So again, we're going to start here and then come up and then just skip that part, come down and wrap around through the base and add this part like we did in that B. Now for this part on the B, when I made it, I started here and came back up, but you could also start at the top and come down. Lastly, we'll add our shading on the curve. The next version of the D is going to be like this one, where we make a short stem, start over here, come around the top, and then come down, and then we're actually going to finish it on the left side of the stem. And add our shading on the inside of this curve. And lastly, we have the fancy D, which will start with this same shape that we made in both the A and the B, with this curved line coming downward. And then I'm going to extend it out to the left. And then before I continue, I'm going to add my shading to this part. We're going to make a loop over here that's going to come around and through and then back up towards the top. Like that. And this motion is pretty hard to make going upward, so if you need to make that loop and then start here and come down, that's okay too. And then we'll finish it by going around and making a big oval shape. So at this point we came down and back up, so we'll add a little bit of shading right here. Alright, so just to recap, we have 3 styles of each letter. The first one is the most basic, then we add a little bit of something, and then the third one is the fanciest. So you can try these styles, or you can make your own variations of them. You can change up something about what these letters look like, or make your completely own version. It's up to you. Just remember the basics of adding shading to the downstrokes.